Abridged book, A Little Life, by Hanya Yanagihara. In a small apartment in Manhattan, four friends struggle to find their place in a world that never ceases to challenge them. Jude, Willem, JB, and Malcolm try to build their lives while burdened by pasts that haunt them and dreams that seem impossible. Part 1. The Stillness Before the Storm. The Manhattan sun streamed through the windows of the small apartment on Lispenard Street, bathing Willem and Jude's faces in a cold light. They were there, surrounded by bare walls and half-built dreams, barely hanging on to the tightrope of hope. "There's only one closet," Jude said, sliding open the accordion door. "Never mind," Willem replied with a weak smile. "I don't have anything to keep in it anyway." "Me neither." That was his life, a constant exercise in denial and resilience. Jude, with his stiff gait and constant internal battle, hid a pain so deep that none of his friends could imagine. Willem, on the other hand, seemed like the anchor, strong and bright, although his own insecurity silently gnawed at him. The apartment, of course, was not his. The property manager had shattered his hopes in her office hours earlier. They don't earn enough to cover 6 months' rent, and they have no savings. She looked at them as if they were children playing at being adults. They need a guarantor, a boss. Their parents. Willem stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Our parents are dead." That sentence resonated like an empty echo, leaving the manager speechless for a moment before she stood up sharply. At Pho Viet Hong, the usual Chinatown restaurant, the incident became a joke, a mask for rejection. JB and Malcolm laughed out loud as Willem recounted the scene with exaggerated drama. "We're staying here," JB announced between spoonfuls of sugary soup, a flat full of rats and a view of the exhibitionist across the street. "It's perfect." Jude cracked a smile, but his eyes couldn't find the spark. Deep down, each rejection stirred something inside him, something fragile and dark. At night, Willem and Jude walked the streets together, talking quietly about their dreams. Willem wanted to be an actor, though his experience was limited to minor roles in independent plays. Jude, with his brilliant mind, had found work in a law firm, but he never spoke of the past that had brought him there. "Do you think things will ever get better?" Willem asked one night as they crossed a misty bridge. "Of course," Jude lied, his lips tightening. And so, in that vast, indifferent city, where every corner seemed to promise as much as it took away, four friends tried to find a space to exist. Their lives were intertwined, full of promises and secrets that none of them dared to reveal. What they didn't know was that this apparent calm was only the prelude. The cracks in their lives would soon become chasms, and the choices they would make would push them to a point from which there would be no return. The danger of the storm is not in its arrival, but in how it tears apart what we believe to be safe. Part 2. The Crack in the Mirror. The apartment in Chinatown had been a temporary relief, but the real battlefield was within them. Each of the four friends carried a wound, and on the nights when they met, amid forced laughter and acidic jokes, their secrets sometimes loomed like shadows on the table. One afternoon, JB burst into Jude and Willem's apartment, waving a photograph he'd just taken. "Look at this," he exclaimed. "It's our masterpiece. We're going to be famous." It was a carefully edited picture of the four of them at university, a montage in which their faces seemed to reflect an idealized, perfect youth. But Jude, looking at it, felt something inside him fracture. "What do you think, Jude?" JB persisted, pointing at the picture. "It's beautiful," he murmured, avoiding eye contact. But it wasn't. Because what he saw wasn't an ideal image, it was a lie. Jude began to distance himself, even from Willem, his closest refuge. In the early mornings, when insomnia struck, he would lock himself in the bathroom, pressing a razor against his skin in a desperate attempt to release the pain that was suffocating him. Willem could feel the bandages, the clumsy excuses, but he didn't know how to break through the wall Jude had put up. "You want to talk about it?" she asked one night, finding him sitting on the balcony, looking out over the city. "Talk about what?" Jude replied, feigning indifference. "Whatever it is that's tearing you apart." Jude stared at him for a long moment, his dark eyes filled with something unfathomable. Then he shook his head. "There's nothing to say." Meanwhile, Malcolm was torn between his identity and his family's expectations. He lived under his parents' roof, in a house as big as his insecurity. Despite working at a prestigious architectural firm, he felt his achievements were an empty echo. One night, during dinner with everyone, JB attacked him with his sharp tongue. "Are you still living with your parents? Don't you think it's time to be an adult?" Malcolm clenched his fists under the table. "What about you, JB?" he replied in a low but venomous voice. "When are you going to stop pretending to be an artist?" The tension was palpable, and Willem intervened, trying to calm the waters. But the rift was wide open, and none of them knew how to mend it. JB, for his part, was sinking deeper into his narcissism, convinced that success was just around the corner, even though his art was beginning to reflect his desperation more than his talent. His loft, always filled with smoke and laughter, was a chaos of egos and resentments. But even he, the most self-centered of the group, was beginning to notice that Jude was falling apart. "You're too skinny," he said one night, as Jude barely touched his food. "I'm fine, JB," Jude replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not. None of us are." That night, when Jude returned to the apartment, Willem found him in bed, eyes closed but clearly awake. "When are you going to let me help you?" Willem asked, his voice a helpless whisper. Jude didn't answer. The cracks between them grew, but so did the ones each carried within them. Manhattan, with its glare and cruelty, seemed to amplify everything, turning their hopes into mirages and their secrets into razor-sharp blades. Sometimes the most dangerous crack is not between us, but within us. Part 3. Footprints in the Sand. Time began to flow like a relentless river, dragging the four friends in directions they themselves did not fully understand. Manhattan remained their backdrop, immense, merciless, absorbing their triumphs and failures without flinching. But while the lives of JB, Malcolm and Willem moved forward, Jude sank into an ever darker abyss. Jude became an elusive figure, appearing at meetings only when he had no other choice, always with that controlled smile that didn't reach his eyes. Willem, for his part, kept his gaze fixed on him, waiting for some sign that he could break through the silence that separated him from his best friend. "Remember when we dreamed about this?" Willem said to him one night, as they shared a bottle of cheap wine on the balcony. "With what?" Jude replied, looking out at the horizon as if the city lights could offer him comfort. "With living in the city, with doing something great. You as a lawyer, me as an actor." "You will," Jude murmured, looking down. But Willem couldn't ignore the signs, the excuses to avoid meetings, the bandages Jude tried to hide. His inability to accept any kind of emotional closeness. Every attempt at help was a wall he ran into, a door Jude slammed ever tighter. Meanwhile, JB continued to pursue his own idea of success. His photographs, filled with an aesthetic as raw as they were controversial, were beginning to attract attention in artistic circles. In an exhibition at a Soho loft, JB had included a portrait of Jude that captured something deeper than his face. It was an image that seemed to lay bare his pain, his fragility. When Jude saw her, his expression hardened. "Why did you do this?" he asked, holding the photograph like a weapon. "It's art, Jude. It's real. It's you. You have no right to show me like that." The argument escalated, and it was Willem who intervened, dragging Jude away before the confrontation became untenable. That night, in the apartment, Jude collapsed on the bathroom floor, his hands shaking and his gaze lost. "Let me help you," Willem said from the doorway, maintaining a distance he knew Jude needed. "You can't help me," came the sharp reply, like a knife in the air. For his part, Malcolm struggled with his own insecurities. In his professional life, he designed dream spaces for others, but his own life seemed stuck in an empty lot. His relationship with his family was a constant tug-of-war. His parents saw him as a reflection of their expectations, while Malcolm could barely recognize himself in the mirror. "What are you really building, Malcolm?" Willem asked him one night, when the three of them met at the old Chinese restaurant they used to frequent. "I don't know. Maybe nothing." Tensions between the four of them were mounting, but what held them together was that intangible connection, that unspoken promise of friendship that, though fractured, continued to hold. JB continued to push the boundaries of what was acceptable in the name of art. Malcolm sank deeper and deeper into silence. Willem tried to be the glue, but his own dreams of performing on Broadway were falling further and further away. And Jude. Jude was the epicenter of something everyone could feel, but none code fully understand. One afternoon, as they walked along the beach on an impromptu getaway, Jude blurted out something no one expected. "Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't be here." The silence that followed was deafening. Willem, JB, and Malcolm exchanged glances, each processing those words in their own way. But it was Willem who broke the silence. "Don't say that. You're the reason we're still together." Jude smiled, but didn't answer. His footprints in the sand seemed to fade with each wave that touched them, as if he wanted to erase his presence. Sometimes, the marks we leave behind are the easiest to erase. Part 4. The False Peak. The apartment in Chinatown seemed smaller with each passing day, as if the walls were closing in, pressing in on the silences that crackled between the four friends. On the surface, things seemed to be looking up. Willem had landed a supporting role in an off-Broadway play. Malcolm was working on a major architectural project, and JB had gotten his photography series exhibited in a prestigious gallery. However, these victories were thin layers of veneer over his internal fractures. Jude, for his part, was absent in more ways than one. Although his career as a lawyer was thriving, his days moved on autopilot. The nights were another story. In the solitude of the apartment, memories of his childhood haunted him, shadows that followed him like ghosts he couldn't fight. "How's the pharmaceutical company case going?" Willem asked him one night, trying to connect with him. "Good. We won an important motion yesterday." "And that doesn't make you happy?" Jude looked at him for a moment before answering. "What is happiness, Willem?" The question hung in the air, like a burden neither of them could bear. Willem didn't press the issue. He knew that pushing Jude was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Meanwhile, JB was at his peak, or so he thought. The night of his exhibition, the gallery was packed with critics, artists, and admirers. Everyone admired his portraits, those images charged with a rawness that bordered on cruelty. But when Jude saw his photograph was the center of attention, something inside him snapped. "Why do you keep using my life for your projects?" Jude snapped, stepping away from the crowd. "It's art, Jude. It's not personal. It's my life. My wounds. You have no right." Jude walked out of the gallery without looking back, leaving JB frozen in the middle of his success. That night, Willem found him in the apartment, sitting on the bathroom floor with a vacant stare and wet eyes. "I can't take it anymore," Jude whispered, almost inaudibly. Willem knelt in front of him, his hands shaking. "Then let me help you. Please." "There's nothing you can do, Willem." Meanwhile, Malcolm was grappling with a dilemma in his personal life. A loving relationship that had begun to brighten his days suddenly became fragile, staggering under the weight of his insecurities and the pressure of his family. During a dinner with his parents, his mother made a comment that paralyzed him. "You can't build a family if you don't even know who you are." The words followed him for weeks, a constant echo in his mind. Did he really know who he was? What did he want? His friends seemed just as lost, each trapped in their own labyrinth. The only one who seemed to float above it all was JB, but his success was isolating him. In an attempt to make amends with Jude, he showed up at the apartment one night with a bottle of wine and a rehearsed speech. "I'm sorry, Jude. I didn't mean to hurt you." "It's not enough, JB. What do you want me to do?" Jude looked at him with unfathomable sadness. "I want you to stop using me as if I were just a story to tell." The tension between them did not go away, but JB began to understand that his art could not save their friendship, and that there was a fine line between inspiration and exploitation. However, even in the midst of these tensions, there were moments of hope. One night, Willem managed to get tickets to a play, and the four friends met at a small restaurant after the performance. Between laughter and reminiscing, it almost seemed like the cracks were closing. But it was an illusion. Like a mountaineer who believes he has reached the top, the friends were about to discover that the real climb and the real fall still awaited them. The top always seems closest just before the ground disappears beneath your feet. Part 5. The Abyss Beneath Our Feet. The fractures they had tried to ignore for so long finally became unbridgeable cracks. The friendship that united them began to falter under the weight of the secrets, resentments, and shadows they each carried inside. And at the center of it all was Jude, trapped in a labyrinth from which he did not know how to escape. It was a cold night in Manhattan, when Willem found Jude on the balcony of the apartment, looking out at the city as if searching for something he couldn't reach. The wind ruffled his hair, but Jude remained motionless, wrapped in his usual silence. "Can you talk to me, Jude?" Willem asked, his voice thick with frustration and fear. "About what?" Jude replied, not taking his eyes off the horizon. "About whatever is tearing you apart." Jude didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "There are things you can't understand, Willem. Not you, not anyone else." Meanwhile, JB was beginning to sink into his own abyss. His success as a photographer no longer fulfilled him as it once had. The guilt of using Jude as the central subject of his art gnawed at him, though he never knew how to honestly express his regret. One night, in the middle of a party full of strangers, JB broke down in tears in front of Malcolm. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" he asked, holding up an empty glass. Malcolm, always the most composed of the group, looked at him with a mixture of compassion and exhaustion. "I don't know, JB. But if you keep this up, there won't be anything left to save." Malcolm had his own demons, too. Their love affair, which had been a beacon of hope, ended abruptly when his partner realized that Malcolm didn't know what he wanted. Mired in a whirlwind of self-criticism and family pressure, Malcolm withdrew even further, avoiding meetings and focusing solely on his work. But the real blow came when Jude disappeared. One morning, Willem woke up to find the apartment empty. Jude's phone was off, and his bed was untouched, as if he hadn't slept in it. Panic gripped Willem as he called JB and Malcolm to find him. "What if something happened to him?" Willem asked, his voice cracking. "He wouldn't do that," JB replied, but even as he spoke, his expression showed doubt. 2 days passed before Jude finally reappeared, exhausted and covered in small cuts on his hands. When Willem confronted him, Jude simply shrugged. He needed time. "Time for what?" Willem exclaimed, on the verge of tears. "To breathe," Jude replied, his voice a reflection of a pain he couldn't share. The episode left the friends reeling, unable to ignore the obvious. Jude was falling, and they didn't know how to stop his fall. One night, during a tense dinner at Malcolm's apartment, Jude finally spoke. "I'm not what you think. I'm not strong. I'm nothing." The silence that followed was devastating. Willem tried to reach out, to hold him in this moment of vulnerability, but Jude had already closed the doors again. "You don't have to do it alone, Jude," Willem told him. Jude looked at him, his dark eyes filled with infinite sadness. "I've always been alone." The gap grew deeper, and although the four of them tried to stay together, their lives began to separate like the branches of a fallen tree. The time they shared was shorter, the conversations were more tense, and the feeling that something irreparable was happening followed them like a shadow. Sometimes the ground doesn't just disappear, it just crumbles beneath your feet, until there's nothing left to hold you up. Part 6. Echoes in the Dark. Jude had become a shadow of himself. Routine was his only refuge, a fragile structure that kept his world together. He worked tirelessly at the firm, handling cases with almost inhuman efficiency, but the nights were another territory, a battlefield where he fought against the echoes of a past that never let him go. Willem, worried, began to spend more time with him. He put aside auditions and dinners with acquaintances to sit on the couch next to Jude, although many times the hours passed in a suffocating silence. "What can I do to help you?" he asked one night, breaking the tense calm. Jude, who had been staring at his bandaged hands, slowly looked up. "You can't do anything, Willem." The estrangement between them wasn't the only sign that things were falling apart. JB, caught in a spiral of self-loathing, began seeking solace in substances that only drove him deeper. His nights out became a desperate cry for something he didn't even know how to define. Malcolm was passed out in his loft, surrounded by empty bottles and cocaine residue. "You can't go on like this, JB," Malcolm told him as he was helped to his feet. "So what?" JB replied with a bitter smile. "Jude is killing himself silently, and none of us can do anything about it." Malcolm, for his part, felt increasingly trapped in his role as mediator. As his personal life was in turmoil, he tried to keep the group together, although every effort seemed futile. In a conversation with Willem, he let out his frustration. "We're all broken, Willem. I don't know how to fix us." But it was Jude who hit the deepest rock bottom. One night, after returning from work, Willem found him in the bathroom, unconscious, with an empty bottle of pills beside him. Terror gripped Willem as he called 911, his hands shaking as he held Jude. "Stay with me, Jude. Stay with me. Please," he whispered, as if his words could anchor him to life. Jude survived, but something changed that night. Willem, exhausted and filled with despair, made a decision. "I can't keep watching you destroy yourself. If you don't accept help, Jude, I can't stay here." "You don't understand, Willem. No one can understand." "No, I don't understand," Willem replied, tears in his eyes. "But I love you, and I'm not going to sit back and watch you go by." That confession left Jude speechless, but despite Willem's promises, the weight of his own demons kept him locked in a prison of his own making. JB and Malcolm also tried to get closer, albeit clumsily. One night, the three of them met at Willem's apartment, where Jude was secluding himself, and discussed how they could help him. "We can't ignore this anymore," Malcolm said. "So what do we do?" JB replied, frustrated. "He doesn't want our help. That doesn't mean we should stop trying." Echoes of that conversation stayed with them long after the night was over, a reminder that even though the darkness was overwhelming, they weren't ready to give up. Yet the cracks between them continued to grow, and the feeling that something irreversible was about to happen haunted them like a shadow. In the days that followed, Jude seemed to be fighting harder, but also more desperately. Willem's words echoed in his mind, a mix of hope and guilt that kept him on edge. What if he couldn't change? What if, in the end, darkness was all that was left for him? In the darkness, echoes always return, bringing with them the words you thought you had forgotten. Part 7. The Impossible Redemption. Life went on, as if the world refused to stop despite the cracks that separated friends. Willem tried to stay close to Jude, although each day seemed like a titanic effort. JV and Malcolm struggled to keep their own lives afloat, but Jude's absences and Willem's emotional toll kept them in a constant state of tension. One night, Willem and Jude had a conversation that would change everything. They were in the apartment, enveloped in the silence that had already become their language. Willem turned to Jude, determined to say what he had been holding back for weeks. "I love you, Jude." Jude looked at him, stunned. He'd never heard those words spoken so directly before. "I don't know how to reciprocate that, Willem. I don't know if I can." "You don't need to know now. I just want you to know." That confession left a mark on Jude, but also a burden. He couldn't help but wonder if he was worthy of that love, if he could sustain it without destroying it. The wounds from his past were still raw, and every attempt to confront them seemed to push him closer to the abyss. Meanwhile, JB was trying to make peace with Jude, but his direct and sometimes insensitive approach was complicating things. One night, during a meeting at Malcolm's loft, JB broke the ice with his usual sarcasm. "You know, you should let me photograph you again. Something more hopeful this time." Jude looked at him with a mix of disbelief and resignation. "Hopeful? Do you really think there's any of that in me, JB?" The silence that followed was crushing. Even JB, for all his ego, knew he'd crossed a line. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that." "It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all, really." Malcolm, who had always been the more pragmatic one, tried to intervene, but his attempts to mediate only underlined how fragile the connection between them was. The conversation fell apart, leaving each of them in their own corner, struggling with thoughts they couldn't share. Willem decided Jude needed more than just words. One afternoon, he took him to a park on the outskirts of the city, away from the noise and lights that always surrounded them. "I want you to see this," Willem said as he pointed to the horizon. The sunset tinted the sky with warm colors, a contrast to the usual coldness Jude felt inside. "What am I supposed to see?" "That there's more beyond what you carry inside." For a moment, Jude allowed Willem's words to filter through, but the shadow of his past was still there, unmovable. The final fall came one night, when Willem was out and Jude was left alone in the apartment. The memories came back strong, suffocating, and Jude made a decision he had considered so many times before. He wrote a short note, no details, just an apology. But as he was about to leave, Willem returned sooner than expected. "What are you doing?" Willem asked, alarmed by Jude's expression. "I can't go on, Willem. I can't." "No, Don't do this to me. Don't do this to yourself. Willem's words cracked in the air, heavy with desperation. He reached out to Jude, holding him as if he could keep him from falling apart. Please, stay with me. We'll fight together. That night, Willem didn't leave Jude alone. He held him until exhaustion overcame them both, promising himself that no matter how long it took, he wouldn't let Jude face his demons alone. But even with that promise, they all knew the path to redemption was uncertain. Some chasms were impossible to climb, and the only question left was how long they could hold on before falling. Redemption doesn't always mean victory. Sometimes, it's just the act of continuing to try, even when the end seems inevitable.